Hi, this is Jeff Anderson. I'm the president and CEO of Agile by Design, and welcome to the Agile Uprising podcast.
Greetings and welcome to another edition of the Agile Uprising podcast. I am your, once again, here I am host, Jay Hrcsko, and with me I have fellow board member, Colleen Johnson.
Hey, everybody.
I have a coalition member and good friend of mine, Ben AuYeung. Ben, did I say that right?
You did. What's up, Jay?
Fantastic. Thanks for joining me this evening. And the topic of this episode is we're going to be discussing the very hot off the presses book, Agile Organization Design, with the author, Jeff Anderson. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Jay.
So, Jeff, for people who may not be familiar with you or your work, you want to give us a little bit of background, a little bit of introduction to about yourself?
Sure. I would consider myself to be a passionate Agile practitioner for about 20 years. About 12 years ago, I started, I'll call it an Agile transformation consultancy within the halls of a larger sort of mainstream consultancy group over at Deloitte. Back when sort of Agile was kind of poo-pooed by everybody that was sort of in those fields. And I was fortunate enough to be given the opportunity to do Agile transformation wrong in every possible way that you could, as you can imagine, being in a big consultancy. So too top-down, too centralized, too much focus on method and process. Like you name it, I did it. I suffered from it. And it was an incredible learning experience because I started understanding that you can really do Agile transition in a much different way. And so what happened is a core group of us left and started our own firm about 5 years ago called Agile by Design. And I've been working with a moderate-sized team ever since then, helping larger organizations improve their agility.
Okay. So let's dive right into the book. So truth be told, full confession time, I wasn't even looking for this book. So Ben has been harassing me to get into a book club to read the newest Dan Vacanti book, When Will It Be Done? So I go on to Lean Pub and I'm bouncing around. I enter Agile in the search bar and Agile Organizational Design comes up. And I remember a couple of years ago, I won't name the author or the book because it was terrible, but I read a terrible book on Agile Organization Design. And I thought, okay, I'll take a flyer on this. It's $10. Let's see if it's better than my last experience. I got past the initial section. I got to the point where you started talking about, and we were talking about it before we even started. You started talking about your sources of inspiration. And immediately I texted Ben. And I sent Ben the link and I said, Ben, this is in your wheelhouse. You got to read this. I blasted through it.
Awesome.
I stopped. I emailed Ben again. I said, Ben, I just finished it. Have you bought it yet? What are you doing? What are you doing? And then I read it again. So for our listeners, and of course, Jeff, I will be putting links to your website, to Lean Pub, everything in the show notes. Your sources of inspiration, along with the stuff you've covered in your career, you rattle off real quickly, David J. Anderson and the Kanban method, the works of Don Reinerson, which I know is Ben's spirit animal. Don Reinerson is Ben's spirit animal. Jürgen Appelo and his work, all of his work stuff on Management 3.0, right, and how to motivate people. You touch on large-scale Scrum, right, and the concept of a traveler, which we're going to go into in a bit because I find that really fascinating. You talk about Bjart's and his book Beyond Budgeting, right, which everybody talks about, but I can't find a person that's read it, so I'm glad to go in on that with you. You talk about microservice architecture. You went in on domain-driven design, which hit a nerd sweet spot for me because Gifford and I just did an episode on domain-driven design. And then you talk about another one of Ben's fans, Niels Flagning, and organizing for complexity. So before we go into the actual content of the book, Jeff, I want to ask the probably banal question: why a book and why now?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. You've mentioned a lot of really inspirational sources that all touch on organizational design, but it's most of those books, it's not the core concept, with the exception of Organizing for Complexity. And I think there's actually, if you talk to a lot of very experienced Agile practitioners, they understand that Agile is fundamentally an act of organization and reorganization. It's the ability of, we can call them teams, we can call them feature squads or pods or whatever, it doesn't matter. But this ability for a small cluster of people to align under high social cohesion and social density, and figure out how to co-create something together is an act of organization. And a lot of Management 3.0 touches on this. The Kanban method I think, is all about organizing and reorganizing. And there's so many patterns underneath the Kanban system around how you can allocate people, or how people can self-form into these clusters. But it's, you really have to dig deep to understand that that's what this is. And it's not obvious to the layperson. So if you're, a manager in a large scale enterprise, and you're saying, I want to go and increase my agility, and they won't even say it that way. They'll say, I want to go do agile because that's the next big thing that I've heard about. They're going to get a lot of dogma, which is going to say, put everybody into cross-functional teams, and magic will happen, and your problems will all be solved. And they'll do that, and they'll have 50-person teams, and no one can collaborate. And then they'll have teams that have all these handoffs all over the place, and nobody's collaborating. And so I wanted to take some of the deeper thinking that's in a lot of these good texts and try to make it more practical and more pragmatic and approachable for the average layperson who's like, I just want to help get stuff done, and I want to know how to do agile in a practical, pragmatic way. I took it from the lens of structure. Obviously, there's more to it than structure. There's mindset, there's motivations, and everything else. But I wanted to really show people how they can use structure to their advantage.
Mm-hmm. And Ben, you picked out some notes from this, right? As you were first running through it?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, I do want to talk a little bit about the Organize for Complexity inspiration in particular, because that's something that is quite unique, at least in the visualization and the structure, compared to a lot of the other agile stuff that you see out there. And I wanted to hear, from your words, what you got out of that and how you thought that fit in really well, and how you applied it and kind of married it to all this other agile stuff, because I think you did it really well. So I'd like to hear your story on that.
Well, the interesting thing is I came into Organizing for Complexity relatively recently compared to all the other things that I was doing. Maybe less than a year, 6 months or so ago. It's material that I'd already heard of, and I was always aware of it, but I just hadn't taken the time to dig in. But I knew it would be complementary to all the practical sort of organizational tools that I was using. And as soon as I read it, I immediately started adding some chapters to the material that I was putting, and sort of changed my mentor model for organizations. The big thing I took from Organizing for Complexity is it allows you to get rid of this notion that an organization is a pyramid with layers of authority and compliance and enforcement. I mean, you could still have those things there, but the more interesting model for an organization is really a network of teams that are market facing, that are customer facing, and that are all trying to achieve some kind of market outcome, supported by a core or a support center that's interacting with these sort of market facing teams through choice. And it's this notion that you can use choice to pull value across the organization and have this market-oriented organization that's really a bunch of autonomous, sort of almost micro enterprises is a really compelling vision.
Yeah, I remember hearing Niels, who's the author of Organized for Complexity, say one time that teams who are part of this alternative structure, not the pyramid, but something more cell-shaped or peach-shaped, they're sort of doomed to be entrepreneurial. And you go into some detail as to, you go into some detail as well about how that is more ideal for today's environment and atmosphere compared to what worked in the past. And I actually think that's really closely tied together with the impetus for Agile in itself anyway, or the attribute of agility. Would you mind speaking to that a little bit, of how this different structure fits the current environment better than the past?
Well, I think one of the the most interesting things that Agile got right is the notion that a self-organizing team of individuals who don't agree with each other and exhibit radical transparency are much more predisposed to deal with emergence and complexity and uncertainty than a few really, really smart people at the top of the organization who are trying to predict, the weather 6 months from now and then cascade all those plans down and then get some information and cascade them back up. So the old model was based on long lead times. We had very, very scarce markets. And you really wanted to squeeze efficiency. You want to make things as cheaply as you possibly could. And so that's kind of like, our management revolution that's, over 100 years old right now, but unfortunately is still the predominant model of organizations. And now what we're seeing is either officially or unofficially, thanks a lot to Agile, as well as, I'll call it sort of almost post-Agile, things like Neil Flaglin, Corporate Rebels, if you've ever read that book, Frederick Laloux's, kind of reinventing organizations, is we're coming up to this notion that if you really want to deal with complexity, speed matters over cost. And you've got to be fast, and not I don't mean fast as in like go and rush and get something at the door, but you have to be fast to learn, and you have to be fast to getting feedback so that you can iterate. And it can't be in a commoditized way, so it's no longer one big lumbering organization all trying to do the same thing. You really need to free people up to do things differently. Now, the one thing I loved about Neil Flaglin's work, and it's something that I've always taken to heart, is being effective at running an organization of teams is more than just having teams. I know a lot of people hate the sports team analogy, but I'm going to use it because it's simple and there's a few parts that actually work. And one of them is that if you were to go to the manager of a sports team, he would have a lot more than just his players as employees. There'd be the people handling the players' finances, contracting, scouts, people getting ice on the rink. You can tell I'm Canadian, right? There's a whole infrastructure there to make sure that team can actually play well. And what I like about Neil's work is it talks a lot about the need for good support structure. It doesn't get into the details of how to do it, which I do in my book a lot more about how to create good support structure. But while we want most people in the Agile teams, you have to consider a lot more than Agile teams if you want those teams to be successful.
So I'm gonna use that example. We're gonna skip ahead in the book. You said the sports metaphor, right? And you have a very, very, I thought it was a very apt metaphor close to the end of the book where you're talking about if you watch a bunch of 6-year-olds try and play soccer or hockey in this case, right? Everybody's standing around. Nobody knows what they're supposed to do. They get in each other's way. No one is talking really except for the coach is trying to get people to orchestrate, right? And eventually either the ball goes in the goal or the puck goes in the goal or it doesn't, right? And it's painful, right? Whereas when you have watch the NHL play or the Bundesliga, everybody, they're not so worried about what their position is. Am I a fullback? Am I a forward? Am I a center midfielder? They're worried about advancing the goal of the team, and the goal of the team is to score a goal and win, right? So you use that analogy, which I thought was very, very apropos of think about when adults play. You're not so apply a sports metaphor to what we do in the corporate world, where you shouldn't be so worried about your role and what somebody's telling you your job is. You should be more concerned about reaching the goal that your team has been assembled for in the first place. Is it, I hate to use the business value term because it's a bit of a sticky wicket nowadays, but the value that you're trying to deliver.
Right. Well, I mean, what's interesting is and now at least people are starting to talk differently, even if not act differently, is most of the literature out there around roles and responsibilities is that, more structure is better. So the metaphor, if I take the sports team analogy is, we had a bunch of 6-year-olds playing soccer or hockey, and it's, everybody is touching the puck. It's the corporate equivalent to we're empowering all the individuals so that everybody gets to weigh in and make the decision. And so you got this kind of like corporate paralysis, basically. So they start putting out racy charts and they start adding in lots of processes and lots of very strict job hierarchies and roles. And that's a lot like playing tabletop hockey or tabletop soccer. It looks more professional. You've got more positions, and everyone's playing in their role, but the puck always gets stuck in the corner. And so the manager has to metaphorically pick up the puck and put it right in front of the player to get anything done. And that's what highly structured organizations look like. The managers don't get less busy, they get more busy because they're always moving the puck and putting it between two people. And so what I really try to help organizations do is skip that second level. It's kind of interesting. A lot of people say Agile is the opposite of waterfall. Many of my clients, I walk in and it's not waterfall, it's the problem. It's a complete hackathon. Everything is just chaos everywhere. And usually when I come at the same time that some more formal consultants have come in, and they've come in with the racy ticket parade where they're just trying to structure
Nice.
everything.
And we were talking right
And
before
I'm trying to get to level 3. Sorry,
Yeah.
sorry, Colleen.
I was going to say, we were talking right before you joined us, Jeff, about like the comfort in being able to challenge some of the Agile rules, right? Or the Agile structures that are in place in our community. And I think that climate, or that invitation to have a frank conversation about what's working or not working, regardless of the playbook, is being more invited, right? We're all able to say, like, this isn't working. Like even Heidi Helfand's new book around, or her second edition, right, on dynamic reteaming, I think challenges some of those structures that you're talking about here. So I want to hear from you a little of those things that you're breaking down in the book, like stable teams, autonomous teams, T-shaped people. Let's dig into some of those things and why you think it's important to kind of break down those constructs of the Agile rules.
So there's probably a chapter in my book which is truths, myths, and lies about Agile teams, and I'm sure there's a whole lot of people that will want to burn me in effigy after I read it, and after they hear this podcast. But basically, I think there's a lot of Agile dogma around completely stable, completely dedicated team members, and that's how all Agile starts and stops. And I just don't think it's realistic. The people will point to the Spotify model or other models, but then when you dig in and talk to those people, you realize that's not how it happened at all. The truth is quite different. So what I've tried to do is distill this into a number of patterns. And what I've sort of tried to say is, an Agile team is one pattern. It's market facing, it's stable, it's cross-functional, you've got everything that you need. And if you can do that, please go and do that. But in 95% of every organization I've ever been in, we couldn't do that. And they might say it's politics. You might say it's bad technology or old technology. You might say they're just not ready. But for whatever reason, I have yet to see that nirvana happen, at least in a big corporate enterprise setting. But what I have seen is with just a little bit of flexibility, you can get to some really good social cohesion. So let's pick on the first one. There are no real stable teams. You don't necessarily need to have everybody being stable and being in the team. I have this concept of a traveler pool. And that's something I borrowed from large-scale Scrum. Some of these patterns I saw in the field, and some of them I just stole relentlessly from other places.
Hey, good artists, what is it? Good artists innovate, great artists steal? Hey.
Exactly, exactly.
Shame here.
And actually, I didn't steal the concept. I called it a specialist pool, but then I saw the word traveler in a less diagram, and I was like, no, a traveler pool, that's much better. So I'm going to go and call it. I've been already implementing them in a couple places. So
feels more free-spirited.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it just feels better. I'm the traveler rather than I'm the specialist. It sounds like something out of a Femme Nikita kind of. No, that's the cleaner. Sorry, I'm getting my metaphors mixed up. What's interesting is that if you try to keep a team completely stable, I've done this in the past. I've walked into an organization, I analyzed their demands, I helped them figure out what the capabilities were. I stood up the teams with them, figured out the model, put bums in seats. We got everybody going. We put a backlog in front of it. And then within 3 weeks, an emergent opportunity came up. And my team structure didn't match the emergent opportunity. And so then what we did is we took that emergent opportunity and split it into two, and it went off into these two teams. And then, 2 months later, another emergent opportunity came up, except for that one could only go into 3 teams. And what I ended up seeing over time is that the more the team structure stayed the same, the less any team was actually able to get anything done. And so it's almost like it was scattering across. And so the second time I did something like this with another client, we put a cadence in place. I said, okay, guys, every 2 weeks, we're going to look at the next wave of demand across sort of a portfolio of these teams. And we're going to ask ourselves, do we want to incur a handoff? Or do we want to actually, encourage the team to move people from one team to the other? This is something that was greatly aided by a portfolio level Kanban system, a portfolio level backlog. We had the pink team and the blue team and the red team and the yellow team, and they all had their strong system capabilities, and they could all do different things. And we were able to, in one instance, we were able to effectively reteam on a bi-weekly basis. And it wasn't about like disassembling the teams and completely changing things around and, complete loss of stability. That happened at the beginning, but after, 6 weeks, it started to stabilize. And then you start seeing little tweaks. The other interesting thing is, at first, I'll admit, it's very manager-led. The managers understand where people need to go, and they kind of make some horse trading. But after a while, it became very team member led, where they could see that the next piece of work was coming in, and they're like, well, I guess I got to go over to that team. So you start having this dynamism where it's only as stable as it needs to be based on the demand. If the demand changes, well, your organization needs to change. If the demand is more stable, there's less variation, you'll have a more stable team structure and a more stable organizational structure. So that was a long answer on just one of them.
No, and I think it's so interesting. When you tie it to some of the concepts around portfolio Kanban and that visibility into what's coming next. Do you feel like that visibility is required to get that kind of self-organization around those needs?
It is for me. And I don't want to say it's required, because there's lots of examples of people that have been able to reteam just through other means. But I learned most of these patterns through Kanban. So it's kind of like I was trying Kanban at the team levels, trying them on departments, trying them at portfolios, reading Don Reinersten's excellent material, listening to David J. Anderson, and then seeing the patterns, these organizational patterns from my Kanban experience. So I wouldn't say that you be dogmatic and thou shalt use Kanban, but it really, I find it really helpful to create the transparency required so that reorganization is just a simple conversation. Hey, we've got to move. We've got to move across over here because that's where I'm needed the most. Basically.
You mean embrace change in teams too, not just in priorities? That's blasphemy, Jeff.
Exactly.
What the hell are you talking about?
I know, blasphemy. So if we hit on an autonomous team, sorry, go Jay. I'm sorry,
keep going, Jeff. Keep going.
I was going to talk about autonomous teams. I make a comment where I say there's no such thing as autonomous teams.
Which is like
people might misinterpret that.
Which is like you're challenging the shibboleth here, Jeff, right? Like everybody, you're really throwing mud in the eye of the Agile industrial complex by saying that.
Exactly. Which is, I actually find it's kind of fun. Anytime there's an industrial complex, even an Agile one, it's probably pretty good to throw some mud there because I think it's time to that's why I like the term Agile uprising. I think that's great. So what's interesting is I sort of challenge these truly autonomous teams in so much as that teams will often need help from other people, but I'm not advocating for handoffs. What I'm advocating is that you can set people up so that they can support other teams. And I talk a lot about the enabler pattern. So the enabler pattern is my counter to what you traditionally would call a governance or a management office or a center of excellence, which comes with a hammer, tells you what to do, gives you the standard, and enforces how to get things done. The problem with the counter to that in a lot of Agile literature that I read is just let the team figure it out. Let them figure out everything from, to the lowest level to the highest level. And if you take that to the extreme, it would be a lot like asking me to go and hunt for all my own food. And I'm terrible in nature, right? Like I can't even navigate with a compass, right? I don't know west from east, right? I would die in 3 hours. So I need someone to come and let me cook food, and like have some food. At least I can turn on an oven basically, but that's about it, right? So I need support structure. So the enabler pattern is the idea. And the Agile Coach is an excellent example of an enabler pattern, but so could the department formerly known as HR, People Operations, be another example. The enabler pattern is you're a small team of people. You want to provide a platform of knowledge or a platform of technology or a platform of experience to try to help the organization apply cross-cutting concerns across the organization. So wherever you have a cross-cutting concern that has organizational value rather than just team value, you try to, as much as possible, provide it as an enabler. You won't always be able to, but wherever you can, use that pattern. And enablers really have two jobs. The first job is I like to think of them as kind of, a good metaphor would be, the Jedi Council or, the Green Lantern Corps, if anybody is slightly geeky.
I got to throw this out there. When you hit the Green Lantern Corp reference, I actually burst out laughing at my desk. I'm like, this guy referenced the Green Lantern Corp. So that's when I IM'd you and said, I just finished reading this book. I need to get this guy on the podcast. Jeff, what are you doing? Because if you threw in a Green Lantern reference, we are talking the same language, my friend. Maybe we'll do an offshoot episode where we just go down the DC Comics nerd rabbit hole. But continue.
So maybe I am either I know the market or I am the market. So the idea is that teams will often be collected into these miniature ecosystems or missions or tribes or whatever you want to call them, and you want to kind of allocate your enablers to, probably bigger than a team, but definitely much smaller than a whole line of business. What's that cluster of 4 to 6 teams that are either sharing a platform or sharing a higher level outcome? I often call these context boundaries. They have some context boundary in common, and you say, go help, go apply. And, at first the enabler may have to go in there and actually go do the work with that team. And so that's, what we call a traveler. So I'll give DevOps as an example, right? A lot of organizations go into two extremes. Every team figures out how to do DevOps on their own, how to do any type of cloud, autonomous engineering, all that provisioning, all that kind of good stuff. Or they go and they create this DevOps team where they're just basically ops with DevOps tooling. And everyone has to go to them and ask for permission, and they go deploy the code for you. And, it's just not really hitting the mark. And so what I've done with several clients is set up these DevOps-like teams. But the first thing they did is they said, we are going to go to teams, and we're going to come in 2 modes. Mode 1 is we're a traveler, and we're actually, because you don't have the expertise, we're going to pair with you, and we're going to help you set things up. And then mode 2 is for teams that are a little more along the path is we're going to coach, and we're going to enable, and we're going to give you some better ideas and some practices and some concepts. And then mode 3 is, our platform isn't good enough for you, and it's not doing what you need it to do, so we're going to act as service providers, and we're going to go build stuff that's going to help you. And they basically, it's almost using the Kanban class of services, where they basically had 3 classes of service. They did use a Kanban system because it was me and I was there, so of course. And they basically had 3 queues, and they tried to they started out with a lot of service provider work. And then, they started gradually transitioning to much more traveler work. And then, of course, as they got more successful, they started moving on to being enablers, true enablers. And they eventually kind of built themselves up that way. And that's the pattern that I think any enabler kind of team, whether it's someone helping you with hiring and recruiting or security or you name it, that's how most support functions can actually start to think of themselves and how to kind of evolve what they're doing, which is from this service provider kind of, do it for you or tell you what to do model to more of a traveler, and then finally more of an enabler approach.
Yeah, which totally helps with that constraint too, where you have, I mean, I've got a client right now that has 7 teams and, 2 UX people, right? So it's that same concept of like, they're trying to have 2 people across all these teams, and we have a constraint that's not going to change anytime soon. We're not going to get
Right.
a UX person for every team, and we probably don't need one. So I love that concept of that enabler. I've been called an enabler, but it's never been in a good way. So I also want to like take that term back.
You can now take that word back and have
I'm
it mean
going. I'm
something
good. Jeff said.
Jeff said, I like it.
I think that ties in pretty closely with something else you brought up about the idea of internal market demand and voluntary use of central services. Can you speak a little bit to that and how that might be not just challenging, but better than the conventional wisdom that's out there?
Well, I mean, the conventional wisdom is if I don't force people to use it, they won't. I have to force them or else they're just going to do their own thing. And I think the modern wisdom is if you give people choice, they'll use it because they won't use it at first, which will cause the service to get better or go out of business. I mean, what's interesting about the market is, if I'm a team of agile coaches who are enablers, and teams have the choice to use me or not use me, and they choose not to use me, it's probably because I'm being too dogmatic. I'm sticking to a framework that they don't like. I'm going at the wrong speed. I'm not providing terribly good advice. There's a whole lot of things that are just not, I'm not being fit for purpose. There's a whole lot of things that I'm doing wrong. And if you give, and I'll call these market-facing teams sort of edge teams, because that's what I like to say is they're kind of right on the edge. If you give an edge team choice to use your service or not, you're going to get the feedback. And that forces these support teams to be more customer-facing. And the customer, of course, being these edge teams. Now, the problem is that's a huge leap of faith for a lot of organizations. So what's interesting about a lot of the agile transitions I've done is it's been within what I'll call a context boundary. I've got, Michael Sahota calls them culture bubbles. And the idea is that somebody at the top is in and wants to do this at a certain level of authority, a VP, an SVP. If you're lucky, you get all the way up to the E's, but that's kind of like, you're talking unicorns and rainbows for a lot of the stuff that I do anyway. And within that sort of context boundary, you can actually shape things a little bit better, and you have more control over some of the things that you can do. So within those context boundaries, there'll be sort of what I'll call like an outer core. So it's not the central area of the organization, which is reporting into head office. It's the support functions that are supporting that context boundary, or that kind of, example might be you're in a really large bank, and the VP of payments, for instance, really wants to increase agility, and he's managed to get control over core product and core delivery and maintenance for technology. But he doesn't have finance, and he doesn't have security, and he doesn't have people. But he could pretty much run, build, and deploy and maintain the product technology stack. So he's got autonomy. And in that case, we were able to very effectively transition a lot of the support functions into this enabler and traveler model. So you got to make sure that when you do this, you do it where you have some political control. And even then, that took us many months to kind of do that. It wasn't the first thing we started with, for sure. We started with the edge, and then we went inwards.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, and it does sound like a tough and sensitive thing to try to tackle. I'm very attracted to the concept, though. I think it makes a lot of intuitive sense, and it really puts that sort of customer end user market pull at the center of things. That if you're not serving them directly, how are you serving those who are serving them directly? And it all just seems to make a lot of sense and line up really nicely. And I think this actually ties really nicely to you talking about domain-driven design in the book, and also you mention inverse Conway's law, which I think is really interesting because we have a tendency to vent about Conway's law and the the more negative effects of it. But I like this idea of inverse Conway's law.
Yeah, so I really like it too. I mean, that's another motivation for me writing this book is not a lot of people have tied these concepts together. And so this is my attempt at doing so. When like, especially if you're a technology delivery organization, and maybe even if you're not, but I'll speak from personal experience. Organizing around business domains makes a whole lot of sense. And domain-driven design has an excellent chapter on, I can't remember the exact name of the patterns. It's just escaping me right now, but it's all about creating a context map, which shows you all of the different areas of knowledge that you've got and how they all relate to each other. And so it talks about how you can actually, it talks about it from a perspective of how teams share code, right? You've got the shared kernel, and you've got the customer supplier, all these different ways that people can agree on who owns what. But if you look at that's really a map for how you can think about organizing teams as well. And, especially with the advent of, event streaming and microservices and sort of service-oriented architecture done well, this notion that you can say, hey, team A, you're going to be responsible for everything within this bounded context, and that your bounded context will be made of a couple of large area domains, and try to only integrate with other domains asynchronously as much as you possibly can. You start seeing how some of this can actually start to scale up as you need to get bigger. And then, they didn't call it Agile, and they probably didn't call it domain-driven design, but if you start looking at organizations like Netflix or Amazon, you start seeing this nice alignment between the teams, the services they're running, the P&Ls that they have, and the whole thing kind of just lines up really nicely together. So you get this kind of inverse Conway effect. Nice light conversation, just
So, and Colleen, you were just we were talking about before we started, right? And this might be a great jumping off point, Jeff. I love the idea of a patterns library, right? The idea of creating a compilation of all these different patterns that you can then use to apply and throw out as it may please, right? And I know I don't want to be part of the whole safe bashing industrial complex. That's its whole own industrial complex, right? As people wave their hands in the video complex. But I think one of the conceptual, when you look at things as a pattern language as opposed to a framework, right? It opens it up to be more like a menu, right? Where here's my menu, here's my recipe for chicken parm. You can use it, you can discard it, you can replace what doesn't work. Maybe Colleen's, allergic to marinara, and we use a different sauce. I don't know, poor person's allergic to marinara, but you introduced the idea of team collaboration patterns, which is the first time I've seen it. And again, as I'm reading this, I'm live blogging it and IMing Ben. And I'm like, Ben, did you hit page 89 yet? Dude, you got to go to 89 right now. Come on, you got to read this. So, Jeff, can you walk us through that a bit? Like, I mean, I don't want to drain the whole book because I really want people to go out and purchase it. I really think it's that important. But can you just give us an idea, like starting off with, you started out with the statement, which might actually be a throwaway statement, but for me, it actually resonated very deeply when you said, not all teams are created equal. And I think that is, we talked about you challenging shibboleths and preconceived notions before. That is a very powerful statement. So can we talk about that and then how that leads into the whole idea of some of the patterns that you came up with for team collaboration?
Sure. So it's interesting because I'm trying to parse the not all teams create equal. I think, and it might have been a throwaway line. I think what I meant by that was that you know what? Let me get back to that one. So I have to parse that one for a second and see what I was thinking. But if I talk about the team patterns. What's interesting is you've kind of got two camps when it comes to how we scale up Agile. One camp says people can just figure this stuff out. And you'll hear that a lot, like the argument against SAFe or DAD or Flex or, any of these other kind of models is we don't need to talk about that because teams can figure this out. My counter to that is, if you look at some of the more popular Agile approaches, they spend a lot of time on individual and team dynamics and how a pair works and how a collection of 6 people work. And I could counter and say, well, that's the easy stuff. I'm not saying it is, but I could say like people are adults. They should know how to behave in a team. And it's all about the higher level stuff that is, that's the hard stuff to figure out, because that's when politics gets in the way and, everything else. So I definitely don't agree with that camp. The other camp will say, you know what, we're going to give you, it's really a framework and you can modify it, but we're going to give you a very fixed set of, things that you can use or not use. Rational Unified Process did it like way back in the day, and then, SAFe did it later. And by the way, I was a big advocate of Rational Unified Process back in its day, because I read the whole thing backwards, forwards, left, right, up, and down, removed 80% of it, figured out the parts that were good. I inserted Alistair Coburn's use cases instead of the big evil kind of ones, and I, made it more. And I put in Michael Kahn's Agile Estimating and Planning as a way to manage my iterations, and I really got a RUP that I could live with. But not your average layperson isn't equipped to do that, because they haven't taken the time to, they're looking at these big frameworks as a shortcut. Well, if I just get this big framework, I don't have to learn all of this stuff. But the framework doesn't stop you from having to learn all this stuff. So what ends up happening is, if you want to be successful with this framework, you have to learn everything you needed to learn anyway, and then learn it even some more so you can know which parts to get rid of, which parts not to. And it ends up being, again, it's a unicorn. The person that can do that is one in a million, who can figure out how to navigate these things and make it contextualized. So the reason I like patterns, sorry, Colleen, you're gonna.
No, go ahead.
Okay, awesome. So the reason I like patterns is it tells you, hey, I've got something to teach you, but you have to learn it, because it's not going to be effective out of the box. You've got to go and look at your context, say, does this pattern make sense? And then as soon as you get that pattern, you've got to go read the next pattern, because all the patterns are related to each other. So it's a steeper learning curve, but it now gives you a set of things that you can apply and adjust and alter together. So that's a bit of a long-winded way of saying, I think if we want to scale agility up well, we've got to start, figuring out ways to make that kind of approach more popular.
Yeah, and I think in listening to you talk about how this varies from org to org too, I think one of the things you talk about is that this traditional org structures are one of the things that holds so many organizations back from seeing success with the agile practices they're trying to implement. Where do you think that resistance comes from, or that fear comes from, in letting go of what we would consider a traditional, or I hate to say a waterfall org structure, but it's just those kind of old school, siloed, specialty driven org structures that can hold a lot of these practices back from being successful?
Oh, that is a loaded question.
That's why we brought Colleen.
The enabler.
Yeah. Most people who are in positions of power simply are not, they're really not incentivized to let all of this stuff go. They have a lot of very personal risk that they're taking. There are models now. There are case studies. There's lots of proof that the new approach works better than the old approach. But even a lot of people that I've spoken to who are executives who want to, it's really all about trust. You're saying, listen, none of this stuff is going to eliminate the need for trust, and being able to create an environment where you can trust people and putting high quality people into the organization. And I've talked to some very senior people who are actually very good and want to do the right thing, but there's nothing in their environment that's incentivizing them to truly embrace this at the speed that they might want to. So you get a lot of pecking away at it in safe ways. You get sort of, well, we'll do agile, but we won't. This area is sacrosanct, or this unit can't be changed, or we don't want to, because it's all about influencing. And so what's kept me sane in this job is realizing that this is a job of pecking away at things. It's not, you read the Agile transformation book and you get super enthusiastic and passionate. Like you read Neil Flaglin's book on Organizing for Complexity, and you're like, or Fred Laloux's Reinventing Organizations. You're like, yeah, I'm going to change this entire place to be a completely customer facing, network based, altruistic model. And you get very disappointed as personal natures kick in. So what's kept me sane is This is about influencing people on a very personal basis and finding out places where you can make that change, inviting people to that change, and getting comfortable with rejection, and playing the long game. So
I don't
I hope
know
that
if we
doesn't
could.
dissuade too many people. But
No, that's perfect, and I don't know if there's a better way to end the episode on that one-liner. And I don't want to be cognizant of your time. So, Jeff, where can people find you if they want to get more information? Obviously, we're going to link to the book itself and LeanPub. If they want to contact you, what's the best way to contact you? Any virtual engagements? We're not doing meet space speaking anymore, so any virtual engagements you have coming up? Someone wants to get in touch with you and pick your brain, maybe engage you for some ideas. How do they find you?
they can find me by email, jeff.anderson@agilebydesign.com. You can also find me on Twitter, Thomas Jeffrey. You can also find me on LinkedIn. Just look for Jeff Anderson and maybe put the word agile after it or something like that, and chances are you'll find me. You can also hit our website, agilebydesign.com, where basically, my purpose of the book is to share the knowledge and to get it out there. So practically every chapter that I've written so far has been blogged about on that website as well. Again, I'm not doing any speaking engagements right now. It's sort of been family time and then actually heads down and getting this book out. There's still a few chapters to complete, so I'm still working on that. But if anyone's interested and wants to learn more, I'd love to hear about people trying it, and I'd love to get people's feedback. By all means, reach out, email, Twitter, or however. I'm happy to talk with anybody who especially to hear feedback on what they've tried and what worked and what didn't.
Awesome. So on behalf of Ben, Colleen, and myself, Jeff, I want to thank you for your time. On behalf of Jeff, Colleen, Ben, and myself, I want to thank all of our listeners once again for tuning in. If you enjoyed the episode, rating, review, iTunes, Stitcher, Podbean, Podbros, Podhub, your podcast listening source of choice. We have a very vibrant conversation group in our Discord server. We have a discourse blog as well. We invite everyone to come in and check us out there. We also have a Patreon in case you're interested. And in case you like this episode so much and you want to contribute going forward, we have a Patreon. I'll throw in the links as well. So once again, Jeff, thank you very much. And on behalf of everyone in this episode, until the next time, this is the Agile Uprising Podcast signing out.
Thanks very much, Jay.